Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. My name is Johannes and I am doing videos about camera gear and video gear, Sony cameras, Fuji cameras, and I do a lot of street photography and general advice on how to get better when you're using your camera for photo and video. Glad to see you here, and today we're going to talk about how you can use the Fuji X-M5 for video, or we are going to talk about how I use the Fuji X-M5 for video, and hopefully this will be something that you can use to get started with the camera. So we're going to cover everything from basic video fundamentals to how I set this up for custom settings. I will be talking about how I use this with F-Log 2 and also how I use the film simulations to do video in an easy and fast way, but with great results. And I will also give some tips on how you can get the best out of the camera when you're using it for video. So whether you are a beginner or an enthusiast looking to up your skills, this video is definitely for you. So let's get started. Firstly, before we talk about settings in the Fuji camera, I just want to talk about how you get the most out of your camera when you're doing video. And these are some very general rules that you might have heard before, but if you haven't, they are really key to know because this will help you get the best out of any camera that you might be using. So for smooth motion, you need to remember the 180-degree rule, which basically means whatever frames per second that you are using for your camera, you need to double the shutter speed to get the most realistic motion blur in the frame. And this is really key because our eyes see motion blur in a certain way, and we want to mimic this in camera to get it to look most naturally. So for instance, right now I am shooting in 24 frames per second, and I have set the shutter speed on my camera to 1/48 of a second because this is double of 24. If you're shooting in slow motion, so you're using a higher frames per second, like 60 frames per second, then you need to double that. So it will be 1/20th of a second that you need to put your shutter speed into. Because we have these ground rules on how you should set the shutter speed, is sometimes mean that you will have too much light coming into your sensor, which will blow out the highlights of your scene. And of course we don't want this. So what we will be using are natural density filters, or known as ND filters, because these kind of works like sunshades. Like when you put them on, you will see less of the light coming into your eyes and it will feel more pleasant. And this is kind of the same for your camera. You will block out light so you'll get a proper exposure of the scene that you're filming. Another way to go about this, if you don't have the money to buy an ND filter or you don't have this right now, is of course to crank up the f-stop to a really high f number, like f16, because this will also let in less light to your sensor, but then you will lose the depth of field in your camera. And for some cases, or for many cases, we at least want to be able to control how much depth of field that we want to have in the shot. So the ND filter is really the best option here. You can get an ND filter in different kinds of stops, and you can also get the variable ND filters where you can twist the front of the ND filter, and this will change the amount of stops that it will leave out light of your camera. So I own a variable ND filter from Freewell, which is a magnetic setup. So you put on a magnetic base firstly to the camera lens, and then you can put on magnet filters to use for this setup. And this setup is really great because it also comes with a mist filter, and if you turn around the ND filter, it turns into a polarizing filter, which you can use to block out reflections of certain shots. I really recommend these ND filters from Freewell because I think they are of a really high quality. They produce minimum color change in your shots, and I think they're really good at handling the sunlight coming into your lens, which will give you more contrast, which we really like. I've had other ND filters like from Tiffin that didn't handle the sunlight really well, so it was kind of washing out the image, which of course is something that you don't want. So if ND filters or filters in general are new to you, of course you have lenses that will use different size of filters. But how we go about this is that we buy the biggest filter that we can afford. Then we use these step-up rings to put in front of the lens and onto the filter, so you can get the filter to match your different kind of lenses with the different sizes of filter threads that they're supposed to be using. So let's quickly talk about how I shoot video with my Fuji camera, because one of the great things about this Fuji X-M5 is that it is capable of shooting in f/2 with the 10-bit format. And just to quickly go about this, the amount of bit that you will use is the amount of color that the camera can render. So 5 years ago, it was more common to have an 8-bit camera, but now we are getting these 10-bit cameras out here that can handle a lot more colors, which is really great for us if we want to have a beautiful image out of the camera. So of course I will recommend you using 10-bit with this camera. So the log profiles are really great because this will give you more information in the highlights and more information in the shadows, and this can be handy if you are doing a lot of color grading. But you also get this really washed out image, and in order to use this you really need to do color grading. And if you don't like to do this, then I would recommend you to be using the film simulations instead. But of course on the Fuji camera there is a log to rec converter that will show you an image that more resembles how it would look if you convert it to Rec 709, which is more of a standard color profile. This is really good because this will help you get a more proper exposure, and it is also more pleasing to look at when you are filming. So the film simulations, like in photo mode, offers an immediate cinematic look to your filming without that much editing in the post. This is really good for fast social media products, and yeah, like I said before, if you don't like messing around with a lot of color grading and the f-log. While you cannot customize the film simulation in the same way as you can with the photo film simulation, you can still tweak some settings, and I will show you how I go about this. And I will also show you my favorite film simulation recipe that I use for video. So the way I use my Fuji X-M5 at the moment is that I have set up 2 custom dials for shooting 24 frames per second and 60 frames per second slow motion. This way I can switch quickly between shooting in 20 frames per second and 60 frames per second. I've set this up to be shooting in f/2 because I like to be able to use the high dynamic range that this camera offers. But on the normal video dial, I've actually set a recipe up, which is the cinematic chrome that I like to use sometimes. And at the moment I am still experimenting to find out if I should be using this version more than the f-log. So when you're setting up your Fuji camera for doing video, you want to make sure that you are in the video mode, because you want to change the video settings and not the photo settings. Then we just go into the menu, and some settings you can find in different places, but the most important are placed here in the movie setting list. So down at the bottom, this is where you will choose if you're going to be using film simulation or if you're going to be using f-log. And the other one is where you will be using film simulation. And as you can see, then you have the possibility to be using f-log, f/2, and the HLG codec, which I haven't tested out. Because this is my film simulation mode, if you can say so. As I've said, in the movie mode I'm using a film simulation. I've set this to the other one, which is the one to use film simulations on, and it is showing that I am in classic Chrome. I will show you the last of the settings on this recipe that I'm using. But quickly we just want to go through the 2 settings up here as well. In the first one, you can decide which resolution you want to be using, and I'm just using 4K 16:9. You can use open gate 6.23:2 aspect ratio. This is useful if you want a larger image coming out of the camera and you want to be able to crop in more. And this might also be useful if you don't know if you're going to use the video that you're shooting for vertical or horizontal, because then you have more image to adjust your video output in the way you want. But in this movie mode, I'm just using the 4K version. And as you see, this is where you are going to pick the frame rate. And this may vary depending on which country you are situated in. In general, in the US, you are using 24 frames per second, and in Europe, you're using 25 frames per second, but for some reason I've been shooting in 24 frames per second always, so this is what I am using. Then in the middle section, this is where you are going to choose how many color bits you're going to be using, and the middle one here, the 265.422 MOV is the 10-bit recording. And this is the only way you can get 10-bit out of the camera. And over here in the megabits per second, I am in the movie mode just using 100 at the moment. If you use 200, you will get bigger files and you will get more information to be editing in. But yeah, as I said, I'm testing out 100 at the moment to see if this works fine. Just for social media, you might even just want to go to 50 or even 25 megabits per second, because social media are not really using more, at least if it is for like Instagram, you could probably just be using the 25. And if it was for YouTube, you could be using the 50. So in shooting mode, you want to make sure that you are in manual, because then you can control the aperture and the shutter speed. And we want this to get the correct shutter speed, the 180-degree rule, as we talked about. Then you want to make sure you are in the lowest ISO if that is possible, because this will get the cleanest image for you. So now let's see how you set up the custom recipe for this setting here. Then we need to go to the IQ tab, and in here this is where you will set your film simulation. And this setting I'm using here is the cinematic chrome that I found here on YouTube. So this is not my recipe, but I think this is a really good film simulation video recipe that you can use. So in the film simulation, this is a classic chrome recipe. Then the white balance is set to daylight, but I will change this for whatever setting I need depending on the situation. I will get into this a little bit later. For the dynamic range, we have chosen DR100. For the tone curve, we are at -2 for highlights and -2 for shadows. For the color, we have set this to -2. For the sharpness, we have set this to -4. For the high ISO noise reduction, we have also set this to -4. And the rest of the settings I have not touched. So as I've said, I'm just using my film simulation for the normal movie mode setting on the dial wheel, but you could save this as a custom profile to use really fast if you wanted to, and I will just show you how you do this now. So what you will be doing if you want to do this is that you go up to the top menu, and on page 4, I think, no, on page 3, you will go to the Edit, Save, Custom Settings. And as you can see, I have assigned these two to my 24 frames per second and the 60 frames per second as I've set. So you will go into this, Assigned, and you could save current settings if you wanted to. And I don't want to be doing this because, as I've said, on my C1, I am using the F-Log version. So I rely on using ZBrush when I am shooting, especially in F-Log 2. For F-Log 2, it is generally better to slightly overexpose when you're shooting, because this would allow you to capture more of the shadows, and you can always turn these down in post. But if it's the other way around, you will introduce noise into your footage and you don't want this. So what I do is, when I am shooting for the highlights, I am setting the ZBrush to 85%, because I found this to be a good starting point to expose for the highlights without them clipping. So this could be like a light or a bright sky. That could be the highlights that I want to show up at 85, or just go away when you go to 85. For skin tones, I generally go about a ZBrush around 55 to 60%. And here again, you just want them to start to show on the skin where the brightest part is, because I found this is going to expose the skin just enough without overexposing them too much. When I'm shooting with the film simulation setup, I more use eyeballing because it is easier to see how the image will look. But if I'm using ZBrush here, I would in general put the ZBrush to 95% when I'm exposing for the highlights, and around 70 to 75 if I'm exposing for skin tones. So the way I'm using the X-M5 when I am doing video, if I'm doing like a talking head right now, I would be using the AI function to film me, and hopefully this will turn out fine. I have experienced sometimes that it might drift, so I'm still messing around with the settings to see if I can avoid this. So what you probably should do here if you want to avoid this is you can change the tracking sensitivity to a lower number, and then it will take longer time for the camera to start tracking a new subject, and hopefully it will hold on to you and your face and stay there for a longer time so you don't get any sort of hunting. But as I said, I'm still practicing this myself. So I use the Fujifilm a lot when I'm out doing street photography, and if I'm shooting a street scene, what I have done is that I have set up a custom button for the AEL and AFL button, and I've set this to lock the focus so it will stay in a manual focus. This way I can set the focus for the scene, and I can lock the focus, and I can start recording, and it will not hunt anywhere in the scene. It will just record the video of the scene that I would like, and I found this to be a really useful way to shoot video. I also do this with my Sony cameras if I want to make sure that the camera doesn't start to hunt around and searching for different kinds of subjects. So if you want to set this up for yourself, what you can do is you can hold the display back button, because this is a quick way to get into the button functionalities. Then you go down to the AEL AFL, and you make sure it is set to AFL lock only. And as you see, when you press this button, it will lock the focus and you cannot change it. So another thing to be aware of when you're shooting video, it is that it is really important to get a proper white balance for your shot, because this can really make it hard for you to edit in post how you want the image to look. So you can let the camera set the white balance automatically, but I highly recommend you that you set this yourself to make sure that the scene won't change around and it will ruin the shot for you. So for instance, you can use some of the presets like the daylight preset if you're out in a bright sunny day, or the cloud preset if it is cloudy. You can also set the Kelvin manually if you're using a video light like I am right now, where I know that the light is around 5600 Kelvin. And lastly, you can use the camera's function to read the white balance when you're taking a photo of a white or gray material, because then the camera will tell you what it thinks the white balance should be set to, and you can use this for a proper white balance. Just make sure that when you're doing this, taking the photo, that you're doing it under the light source, so it will set the focus for the light source. So before we wrap up this video, I will also quickly talk about my experience when doing post-process on the Fuji X-M5 video. I found it to be a bit purple, so I usually have to correct it a bit with the green tint. So when I'm shooting in f/2, I actually often use the Phantom LUTs for Sony, because I've bought those way back, and I found that you could use them for a lot of shots and you will still get a pretty decent image out of this. But I might consider buying the Fuji version in the future, depending on how I will use the camera in the future. For the film simulation, I generally just add some sort of contrast by using an S-curve on the image and perhaps add a little bit of saturation. I also like to use the plugin Dehancer, because this lets me add grain, halation and bloom, these qualities of the image that we relate to a filmic look. And I really like Dehancer, and I think it's a great plugin, and I have a code down in my description if you want to get a discount code for you if you consider buying this. Just keep in mind that this plugin is really machine heavy, which can take the fun out of using it. So a final advice is always to do some quick test shots to see how the image look. Experiment with this yourself and don't be afraid to mess things up. By trying this out and doing it a couple of times and remembering what you're doing, you will get the hang of it and you will find out what works best for your way of shooting. Anyway guys, thanks for watching this video. As always, if you found this helpful or entertaining in any way, please make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so I know that this kind of video is something that you enjoy. Thanks for watching and I will see you around. Boy.
I'm the biggest in the game, I'm the one they talk about. Everybody know my name, my resume is loud.